The September rain drummed steadily against the slate roof of Oakridge Correctional Facility, creating a hollow symphony that echoed through its century-old halls. Victoria Blackwell, Tori to the few who dared claim familiarity, stood at her office window, watching the approaching transport van navigate the slick asphalt of the prison yard. 20 years in corrections had taught her the value of distance, of barriers both physical and emotional. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The neat stack of folders on her mahogany desk, aligned with mathematical precision, contained the file of today's loan transfer. Daniel Reeves, 36, convicted of investment fraud, 8 years served of a 20-year sentence, exemplary behavior noted. Her reflection stared back at her, silver streaks now dominating her once auburn hair, the crisp lines of her charcoal suit a testament to her unwavering standards. At 49, Warden Blackwell had earned her reputation through unflinching adherence to protocol. Oakridge operated like clockwork, its gears lubricated by her meticulous attention to detail and the respect, tinged with fear, that she commanded. "They've arrived, ma'am." Officer Cortez's voice interrupted her thoughts. Young, ambitious, with military posture that reminded Tori of herself 2 decades ago. "I'll be down shortly." Her voice carried the practiced neutrality that had become her professional signature. The intake area smelled of disinfectant and resignation. Daniel Reeves stood flanked by guards, his handcuffed wrists held low before him. Tori was immediately struck by the incongruity. This man didn't have the hunched defensiveness of most inmates. Despite the faded denim uniform, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that seemed out of place. His eyes, an unusual amber brown, met hers directly, an unspoken challenge that sent an unexpected current through her. "Mr. Reeves, welcome to Oakridge. I'm Warden Blackwell." She maintained the cool professionalism that had defined her career. "We run a tight ship here. Your record indicates you've been working in the library system at Northern State." "Yes, ma'am." His voice had a gentle timbre, cultured and measured. "I've implemented a digital cataloging system and expanded their educational outreach program." Something flickered across his face. A smile, amusement, the subtle reaction unsettled Tori more than outright defiance would have. "You'll continue similar work here. Officer Cortez will escort you to your housing assignment. Library orientation begins tomorrow at 800. As she turned to leave, Tori felt his eyes following her. An unwelcome warmth crawled up her neck. She quickened her pace, annoyed at her own reaction. Back in her office, she reopened his file. Education, Masters in Library Science from Columbia. Previous employment, Digital Archives Specialist at the Metropolitan Museum. Notable skills, fluent in French, Spanish and Mandarin, proficient in rare book restoration. It didn't add up. Men like Daniel Reeves didn't usually end up in places like Oakridge. His crime, a sophisticated investment scheme that had defrauded clients of millions, seemed at odds with his demeanor. There was something missing, something that nagged at the edges of her consciousness. Dr. Chen's weekly medical report arrived that afternoon. Tori scanned it absently until a note caught her eye. Transfer inmate Reeves requests continuation of specialized medication regimen. Documentation attached. She made a mental note to follow up. Details mattered in her world. Overlooking them could be dangerous. October brought the first frost, and with it the first murmurs about the new librarian. Inmates and staff alike commented on the transformation of Oakridge's neglected library. The chaos of misplaced volumes had given way to ordered shelves. The ancient card catalog was being methodically digitized. Reeves had even started a weekly literature discussion group that had surprisingly attracted some of the more troublesome inmates. Tori found herself inventing reasons to visit the library. Each time, she observed Reeves from a distance, How? He explained concepts with patience, how he diffused tensions with quiet authority, how his hands moved with precision as he repaired damaged bindings. "The Hemingway section seems incomplete," she remarked one evening, when only the two of them remained in the library. He looked up from his work, those unusual eyes catching the lamplight. "It is. I've requested some additions to round it out. His essays on Spain, in particular, are worth studying." "You're familiar with his work?" "I wrote my undergraduate thesis on his influence on modern American prose." He slid a book across the table. "This might interest you. It's not Hemingway, but it touches on similar themes: isolation, purpose, the cost of principles." Their fingers brushed as she took the book, and Tori felt an electrical charge unlike anything she'd experienced in years. She withdrew her hand too quickly, nearly dropping the volume. "Warden Blackwell, may I speak frankly?" His voice had dropped to a near whisper. She nodded, not trusting her own voice. "We both know I don't fit the typical profile of your inmates, and I think you're curious about that. About me." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm curious about you too. The woman behind the title." Warning bells clanged in Tori's mind. She straightened, drawing the mantle of authority around herself like armor. "That's highly inappropriate, Mr. Reeves. Is it? Two educated people discussing literature. Where's the regulation against that?" His smile, gentle, knowing, tinged with challenge, stayed with her long after she'd returned to her quarters. The book he'd given her lay on her nightstand, unopened but impossible to ignore. November brought fierce storms that rattled the old windows of Oakridge. The prison seemed to contract against the cold, inmates and staff alike growing more insular as darkness fell earlier each day. Tori found herself in the library more frequently, her conversations with Reeves extending beyond books to philosophy, art, travel. He spoke of Venice in springtime with such vivid detail that she could almost smell the canal waters, feel the ancient stones beneath her feet. "You've lived quite a life for someone so young," she commented one evening as they discussed Renaissance architecture. A shadow crossed his face. "Parts of it feel like another lifetime, another person entirely." Officer Cortez began to notice the change in his superior. Small things. A loosened strand of hair, a lingering glance, the faintest trace of perfume that hadn't been there before. "The new librarian has made remarkable progress," Tori said during a staff meeting, her voice betraying nothing. "We should consider expanding the educational programs he's proposed." Dr. Chen watched her carefully from across the table, her expression unreadable. Later, she approached Tori in the corridor. "A word, Warden. In private." In the medical office, Chen spoke with careful precision. "I've noticed some irregularities in Reeves's medical records from Northern State, inconsistencies in his treatment history." "What kind of inconsistencies?" Tori kept her voice neutral. "Missing pages, treatments that don't match his stated conditions." Chen hesitated. "And his medication requests, they're unusual for someone with his claimed medical history." Tori felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "Continue monitoring. Report anything else you find directly to me." That night, she finally opened the book he'd given her. A slip of paper fell out, a drawing of her rendered with remarkable skill, capturing not just her appearance but something deeper, something vulnerable she thought she'd hidden from the world. At the bottom, in elegant script, "To see and be. Seen is perhaps the greatest human need." The first snow of December brought a strange quiet to Oakridge. Tori stood at her office window, watching white flakes erase the hard edges of the prison yard. Behind her, the small electric heater hummed, fighting against the drafts that seeped through the century-old windows. She had not returned to the library for 2 weeks, had not trusted herself in his presence, but the drawing, hidden now in her private safe alongside her service weapon, pulled at her thoughts constantly. Warren Brick Stone, serving 25 years for armed robbery and assault, watched the warden cross the yard that evening. Her purposeful stride, the tension in her shoulders, he recognized the signs. Information was currency in prison, and this might be valuable indeed. The library was warm, the shelves casting long shadows in the lamplight. Reeves looked up as she entered, his face betraying nothing but professional courtesy. "Warden Blackwell, I was beginning to think you'd lost interest in our literary discussions. I need to speak with you, privately." Her voice was tight, controlled. He nodded to the inmate assistant, who quietly disappeared into the stacks. When they were alone, Tori placed the drawing on the table between them. "This crosses a line, Mr. Reeves. Does it? Or does it simply acknowledge what we've both been feeling?" He met her gaze steadily. "You can have me transferred if you wish, but first ask yourself why you've kept the drawing, why you're here now, after hours, when you could have summoned me to your office." The truth of his words stung like an open palm. When had she last felt truly seen? Understood. Her marriage had ended a decade ago, crushed under the weight of her devotion to her career. Since then, there had been nothing but brief encounters, carefully kept separate from her professional life. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "This can't happen," she said, but even to her own ears it sounded like capitulation. "It already has." He reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "The only question is whether we acknowledge it." The first kiss happened there, among the shelves of forgotten classics, the scent of old paper and leather bindings surrounding them. It was tentative, hesitant, and then it wasn't. Afterward, Tori straightened her uniform, her hands trembling, slightly. "No one can know," she whispered, already hating the weakness in her voice. His smile held sadness and understanding. "In here, secrets are the only currency that matters." January brought the harshest winter in decades. Pipes froze, heating systems faltered, and Oakridge operated in a state of perpetual crisis. Through it all, Tori maintained her reputation for unflappable efficiency, while inside, her emotional landscape had transformed into something unrecognizable. Their meetings became a carefully choreographed dance. Brief encounters in forgotten storage rooms, hushed conversations in the shadows of the library's restricted section. Each time, she promised herself it would be the last. Each time, she returned, drawn by a connection that defied every principle she'd built her life upon. Officer Cortez knew, or at least suspected. Tori caught his gaze sometimes. Not judgmental, but concerned. He had taken to adjusting security patrol schedules, creating small windows of privacy that couldn't possibly be coincidental. "I should put a stop to this," he told Dr. Chen one night as they shared coffee in the empty staff room. "She's risking everything." Chen's reply was measured. "Have you ever seen her happy before this?" Despite the risks, despite the voice. A reason screaming in her mind, Tori felt alive for the first time in years. Daniel spoke of his childhood in Seattle, his travels through Europe, his dreams of writing a novel someday. She shared stories of her own, growing up in a small Pennsylvania mining town, fighting her way through the male-dominated correction system, the loneliness of command. "I've never told anyone these things," she admitted one night, as they sat hidden in the library office, snow falling silently beyond the barred windows. "Perhaps you never found someone who wanted to hear them." His hand traced patterns on her palm. "To truly know another person is rare, Tori. Even rarer in a place like this." February brought a thaw, both literal and figurative. Tori found herself smiling more, the perpetual tension in her shoulders easing. She began to imagine possibilities, his eventual parole, a life beyond these walls. Dangerous thoughts, dreams built on quicksand, but she indulged them nonetheless. Then came the email from the FBI's Interstate Corrections Task Force. Subject: Inmate Identity Verification Request. Urgent. The text was bureaucratic, clinical. Following intelligence developments in an ongoing investigation, we are requesting verification of identity markers for inmate Daniel Reeves, 722481. Please confirm fingerprint records against attached file and report any discrepancies immediately. Tori's blood ran cold as she opened the attachment. The fingerprints didn't match. The man she knew as Daniel Reeves was someone else entirely. With shaking hands, she accessed the secure federal database. The real identity linked to those fingerprints made her physically ill. Jonathan Mercer, wanted for questioning in connection with 3 murders in the Pacific Northwest. Identity theft expert, master manipulator, known for assuming elaborate personas to gain trust. The attached case notes described his methodology with clinical precision. Subject targets individuals in positions of authority, particularly those exhibiting signs of personal isolation. Demonstrates extraordinary ability to customize his approach based on victims' psychological vulnerabilities. Victim. The word struck her like a physical blow. Dr. Chen found her still at her desk at midnight, staring at the monitor. "Tori, are you all right?" The concern in her voice seemed to come from far away. "I need a favor," Tori said, her voice unnaturally calm. "Pull his medical files again, all of them, and run a comprehensive blood panel at his next checkup. Has something happened? Just do it, quietly." She turned back to the screen, already formulating her next steps. "And Natasha? Trust no one with this, not even Officer Cortez." For the next week, Tori maintained the charade. She met with Daniel, no Jonathan, in their usual places, listened to his stories, even returned his kisses, all while feeling as though she were watching herself from outside her body. Each gentle touch, each seemingly heartfelt word, now reinterpreted through the lens of calculated manipulation. The blood work results arrived on a Tuesday morning. Dr. Chen delivered them personally, her face grave. "You were right to be suspicious," she said quietly. "He's been on antiretroviral therapy. He's HIV positive, Tori, and based on his medical records, he's known for at least 2 years." The room seemed to tilt sideways. 2 months of intimacy, 2 months of whispered promises and passionate encounters, 2 months of deliberate, calculated betrayal. "There's more," Chen continued. "I checked with his previous facility. The medications he claimed to need for a chronic condition, they never prescribed them. The records he came with were falsified. Something cold and hard crystallized in Tori's chest. Something beyond anger, beyond betrayal, something that demanded action. Thank you, Natasha. I'll handle this from here." That evening, she called Jonathan to her office. He entered with that same confident smile, the one that had once made her heart race, but now turned her stomach. "You wanted to see me?" His voice held that familiar warmth. "Sit down, Mr. Mercer." She watched the name land, saw the infinitesimal tightening around his eyes. "Yes, I know who you really are. I know everything." For a moment, his mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. Then it was gone, replaced by earnest concern. "Tori, I can explain." "Warden Blackwell," she corrected, her voice like ice. "You will be transferred to maximum security, effective immediately. Your privileges are revoked. You will have no contact with other inmates or staff, except under direct supervision." He leaned forward, dropping his voice. "Listen to me. Yes, I've done things I'm not proud of. I've had to become different people to survive. But what happened between us was real. I've never felt, save it, She stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "Officer Cortez will escort you to your new housing assignment in the pit." As Cortez led him away, Jonathan turned back. "You're making a mistake, Tori. There are things you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." Her eyes were dry, her voice steady. "I understand what happens to inmates like you in maximum security, especially when word gets out about certain medical conditions." His face paled. For the first time, she saw genuine fear in those amber eyes. In the days that followed, Tori moved through her duties like an automaton. She signed the necessary paperwork, attended required meetings, maintained the implacable facade that had defined her career. But inside, something had broken, perhaps irreparably. "He's having a rough time in Max," Cortez reported 3 days after the transfer. "Stone and his crew have been circling." Tori nodded, showing nothing. "Maintain standard protocols." "Standard protocols won't protect him for long," Cortez pressed. "Not with what they're saying about him." She met his gaze evenly. "Is there something specific you wish to report, Officer Cortez?" He hesitated, then straightened. "No, ma'am." That night, alone in her cabin by the lake, Tori opened her safe and removed her service weapon. The weight of it in her hand was both familiar and strange. She placed it on the kitchen table alongside a glass of bourbon and Jonathan's drawing of her. For hours, she sat there, considering options, weighing consequences. By dawn, she had made her decision. The next day, security camera footage would show Warden Blackwell making her rounds as usual. It would capture her brief conversation with Officer Cortez about upcoming shift changes. It would show her signing authorization for maintenance work in the East Corridor, work that would require temporary camera shutdowns in specific areas. What it wouldn't show was her conversation with Warren Stone in the blind spot between camera angles. It wouldn't record the folded paper she passed him, or the words exchanged in those critical moments. Jonathan Mercer was found in the shower, area of maximum security at 3:47 p.m. The official report would cite multiple stab wounds inflicted with improvised weapons. Despite Dr. Chen's immediate response, he was pronounced dead at the scene. Detectives Marcus Hammond and Elena Patel arrived from the state police the following morning. They were experienced, thorough, and immediately suspicious of the convenient camera malfunctions and the lack of witnesses. "Funny timing, don't you think?" Hammond remarked, reviewing the security logs in Tori's office. "Cameras go down for maintenance just when your transferred inmate gets shanked. Budget constraints mean we often have to schedule maintenance during operational hours," Tori replied evenly. "As I'm sure you're aware, Detective, violence between inmates is unfortunately common in maximum security settings." Patel's gaze was more penetrating. "We understand Mercer, or Reeves, or whatever name he was using, had recently been transferred from your general population. Any particular reason?" "Routine administrative decision based on new information about his identity and criminal history." The investigation continued for weeks. Stone and his associates maintained absolute silence. Officer Cortez provided testimony that revealed nothing beyond standard procedures. Dr. Chen confirmed the cause of death, but offered no speculation on circumstances. The detectives found the drawing during a search of Tori's office. She had left it there deliberately, knowing they would eventually look. But a sketch, however intimate, proved nothing. "We know something happened between you and Mercer," Patel said during their final interview. "And we know you arranged his death, even if we can't prove it." Tori met her gaze without flinching. "That's a serious accusation, Detective. One I suggest you keep to yourself unless you have evidence to support it." The case officially remained open, but active investigations ceased after 60 days. Warden Victoria Blackwell continued to run Oakridge Correctional Facility with the same efficiency and discipline that had defined her career, if she sometimes stood at her window longer than necessary, staring at nothing, if she no longer visited the library, if the lines around her eyes had deepened and her hair had grown completely silver. Well, these things happened with age and responsibility. Spring came to Pennsylvania, melting the last remnants of winter. New flowers pushed through the soil. In the prison yard, tenacious and determined, life continued its relentless forward movement. In her office, Tori received the quarterly performance evaluation from the Department of Corrections. Oakridge had maintained its exemplary rating under her leadership. The letter of commendation noted her unwavering commitment to maintaining order and discipline even under challenging circumstances. She placed the letter in a folder, aligned precisely with the edge of her desk, and turned to face the window. Outside, new inmates arrived in transport vans, their faces blurring into anonymity behind the rain-streaked glass. The state investigation officially closed after 3 months. Detectives Hammond and Patel submitted their final report, noting the suspicious circumstances surrounding Jonathan Mercer's death, but acknowledging insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. The file was archived, becoming another cold case in an overflowing system. Oakridge fell back into its rhythms. A new librarian, elderly, soft-spoken, harmless, reorganized the shelves according to the Dewey Decimal System, erasing any lingering traces of Jonathan's meticulous arrangements. Inmates who had attended his literature discussions drifted back to their usual routines. Only Dr. Chen occasionally caught Tori's gaze across the cafeteria, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Summer arrived with brutal heat. The ancient brick walls of Oakridge trapped the warmth, turning the corridors into sweltering tunnels. Tori found herself standing before the industrial fan in her office, eyes closed, remembering winter nights and whispered conversations that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Officer Cortez appeared at her door one afternoon, his expression unusually grave. "Pardon the interruption, Warden. This just arrived from the FBI field office." He handed her a sealed envelope marked "Confidential." Alone, Tori broke the seal. Inside was a brief memo and a flash drive. The memo was clinical. Following closure of the Jonathan Mercer case, attached materials recovered from suspect's previous residence are being returned to your facility as per chain of evidence protocols. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the drive into her computer. It contained a single video file dated 3 days before Jonathan's transfer to Oakridge. She clicked play. Jonathan, his hair slightly longer but unmistakably him, sat before the camera in what appeared to be a sparsely furnished apartment. His expression lacked the warmth and charm she had known. Instead, his face held a cold intensity that sent chills through her despite the summer heat. "If you're watching this, Victoria Blackwell, it means things didn't go according to plan." His voice was harder, the cultivated gentleness stripped away. "By now you know who I really am, what I've done. Maybe you even know why." He leaned closer to the camera. 6 years ago, your testimony put my brother in Lakewood Penitentiary. 3 months later, he was found hanging in his cell. The official report called it suicide, but we both know what really happens to sex offenders in prison, don't we? Especially when the warden makes sure certain information circulates. Tori's breath caught. Michael Lansing, a case from early in her career as warden. She had testified at his sentencing, had followed procedure when informing staff of his crimes. What happened afterward wasn't her responsibility, or so she had told herself. "It took me years to find you," Jonathan continued. "Years to create the perfect identity, the perfect background. The perfect way to make you feel what he felt, targeted, vulnerable, ultimately betrayed by a system you trusted." His smile was terrible in its emptiness. I wanted you to experience what it's like when someone has absolute power over your fate. He paused, something shifting in his expression. What I didn't expect was to actually see you, Victoria, the real you, beneath that perfect warden facade. I didn't expect. He looked away from the camera. It doesn't matter now. You've made your choice, and so have I. The video ended abruptly. Tori sat motionless, the implications washing over her like ice water. His illness, his manipulations. They had been weapons in a vendetta she hadn't even known existed. But the hesitation in his final words suggested something had changed. Something had been real, even amid the lies. She ejected the drive, slipped it into her pocket, and walked to the window. The exercise yard below was filled with inmates, each one carrying their own stories, their own vendettas. How many other time bombs were ticking among them, waiting for the right moment to detonate? That night, in her cabin by the lake, Tori opened a bottle of whiskey and the journal she had kept during those winter months. Page after page of observations, confessions, moments of joy and doubt, all centered around a man who had never truly existed. Or had he? The question haunted her as she wrote a final entry, her handwriting growing increasingly unsteady as the bottle emptied. The call came at 3 a.m. A fire in the east wing of Oakridge, no casualties, but extensive damage to administrative offices, including her own. She dressed quickly, mind already calculating logistics and emergency protocols. As she drove through the darkness toward the glowing horizon, a strange calm settled over her. Perhaps the fire was an accident, faulty wiring in the old building, a cigarette carelessly discarded, or perhaps it was Warren Stone calling in the remainder of whatever bargain they had struck months ago. It didn't matter now. The flames had consumed her office, including the computer that had held Jonathan's video. The flash drive in her pocket felt suddenly heavy. The last piece of evidence, the final part of their story, known only to her now. Detective Patel was already on scene when Tori arrived, her sharp eyes following the warden's movements. "Interesting timing," she remarked, echoing her comments from months before. "Life is full of coincidences, Detective," Tori replied, watching. Firefighters battle the remaining hotspots. "Is it? I've been reviewing old cases recently. Michael Lansing's suicide at Lakewood. Your first year as a warden there." Patel's gaze was penetrating. His brother disappeared shortly afterward, changed his name, his appearance, became a ghost until he resurfaced as your Daniel Reeves. Tori met her gaze steadily. "Are you suggesting something, Detective?" "I'm suggesting that revenge works both ways, Warden Blackwell. And sometimes the target never even knows they're in the crosshairs until it's too late." They stood in silence as dawn broke over the smoldering prison, grey light revealing the charred skeleton of the East Wing. In that moment, Tori understood with perfect clarity. There were no villains or heroes in this story, only people bound by chains of their own making, each link forged from choices that seemed right at the time. She reached into her pocket, fingers closing around the flash drive. One last choice remained, to preserve the truth or let it burn away with everything else. As sirens wailed in the distance, Warden Victoria Blackwell made her decision. Up next, you got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.